So today's lesson we're going to be looking at Islam's relation to peace and conflict. So we're going to be looking at theologically what does Islam, what's Islam's stance with peace and conflict in the world, and practically how does Islam relate to peace and conflict. So first of all, we're going to look at peace. So Islam, as we know, preaches tolerance and equality, and also recognizes that no one can dictate a relationship between an individual and God. So therefore, it's kind of, in a way, that to the core of the religion, there is like a lot of peace in the religion. So Islam is all about seeking peace for its own sake. Indeed, peace is considered in Islam as an essential precondition for submission. The second literal meaning of the word Islam, to the will of God. Only through the creation of peaceful circumstances can the life of faith be implemented in all aspects of human existence. So that's a quote from a very prominent religious scholar in Islam, and so clearly there's a connection between peace, because the whole religion is about submission to God, not to submission to one's own desires, and so they should be focused on preaching and understanding God's word and God's will, rather than conflicting with others. So due to these core values and beliefs, Muslims globally have a strong connection with peace. And just as a kind of contradiction, 9/11 and current terrorist events are a juxtaposition of the true nature of Islam and its contemporary manifestations. So I know a lot of people understand Islam in connection with conflict, but a lot of the conflict goes directly against Islam and its understanding of its religion. So the use of force is always a last resort, and a war of aggression is never an option for Islam, as mentioned in the Quran, as well as in the Hadiths, and we'll come to that a bit later on when we look at conflict as well. So current examples of the way Islam is connected to peace in a practical sense is National Mosque Open Days. So it first started and is run by the Lebanese Muslim Association, and it happens all throughout Australia. So it usually occurs on or around October. Obviously, it doesn't happen if Ramadan is on, but it usually happens on a Saturday in October. And this, this year is happening in October as well. And so this is a way for the Muslim community to spread its religion and the understanding of its religion to people in Australia. You don't need to be interested in converting or interested or you don't have to be a Muslim to go to the open day. It's open to everyone, and it's a way for the Muslim community to try to shape the understanding or change the discourse and understanding of Islam and Muslims to be, of a more tolerant, peaceful one, rather than, of the terrorist association that a lot of people have with Muslims. Also, the Israeli-Palestine Relations Committee is, if you know anything about what's going on between Israel and Palestine, there's a lot of conflict between Zionist or Jewish people in Israel and Islamic Palestinians for land and occupation of Palestine. And the Israeli-Palestinian Relations Committee sits both Jewish and Muslims who are working together for a resolution, and a peaceful resolution in the area, to try to stop the conflict. And it's both Jewish and Muslim people working together to try to resolve this conflict. So again, another good example of Islam's relation to peace, as a lot of the Palestinians and Muslims on that committee also use their religion to try to justify to the wider community why they should fight for peace rather than for conflict. Also, as just a personal micro level, when Muslims greet, they say Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be with you. So just even within their language, there's clear connections Islam has with peace. And there's lots of other examples globally as well that Muslims are doing to try to fight for peace. There was a protest 2 years ago run by Muslims in England to demonstrate their opposition to terrorist acts and terrorism, and it was quite large. And there was also one in Australia as well. And so there's constant and Muslims constantly come on TV and on news programs after terrorist attacks, condemning those attacks and trying to preach love and peace and their kind of opposition to that conflict. Okay, we're going to look at conflict now. Obviously, as we are already aware of, there are connections drawn between Islam and conflict. Some of it we're going to look at is theologically, and also some of it is just circumstances in the social and cultural environments that terrorism is coming out of. So as we know, there are, in a lot of these areas, there are low literacy levels. Add this, as we understand already, with the lack of hierarchy, makes Islam more susceptible to religious extremism. As we know, if you can't or don't have the ability to read the Quran, and you don't have anyone necessarily to turn to, or anyone that you know religiously is going to be the right person, because there is no formal kind of, or well, very limited formal structure of hierarchy. Therefore, you can turn to anyone to understand the religion, and that therefore makes groups of people very susceptible to turning to the wrong person, and potentially turning to extremist groups. Also, as we know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are Sufi Wahhabi, which means they don't necessarily rely on the Quran for their religious interpretations. They rely on other texts like the Sharia and Hadith and Sunnah, and therefore they do read the Quran, but not as strictly as they rely a lot more on the interpretations of the Sharia and Hadiths, which, as we know, generally is not allowed. If there are any contradictions, they should always turn to the Quran, but ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't necessarily do that, which means their interpretations of the religion aren't necessarily accurate compared to general Muslims' interpretations of the religion. There is a term jihad. We might have heard that term already. It does exist in Islam, and a lot of terrorists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda use jihad to justify their conflicts with, so their acts of terrorism and their conflicts with other governments and other people. But it's used as a means for it's used as a means for justifying religious terrorism. But it is one of the most abused and misused Islamic concepts. These, most of the time, the way it's used currently is not its accurate form or understanding of the concept. So jihad is meant to mean a direct struggle, and it's mostly a conceptual struggle, so against one's own greed and ego and desires. So it's meant to be, as Muhammad has said, it is meant to be the supreme jihad is against oneself. So fighting individual greed or individual ego and individual desires, so sexually or otherwise. It also can be used as a conceptual, intellectual, theoretical, oppressive struggle against oppressive totalitarian thought. So, it's meant to be a religious discussion, a religious struggle against those ideas. So if any groups are trying to oppress Islam or are trying to stamp out Islam, then jihad is a means for community to come together and discuss and argue and debate those thoughts. However, it can also mean a physical struggle against oppression and aggression, but the way that struggle is meant to occur, there's lots of kind of restrictions and rules around that religious struggle. It is not, so it's not just simply a holy war, and there's quite a lot of restrictions around it. And you might have also heard that the connection between jihad and the 42 virgins. So it was definitely reported on a lot during 9/11, London bombings in the train lines, as well as Bali bombings. Against the Australians in the nightclub. A lot of news media reported on jihad and the concept of being a martyr, so dying for a cause would mean that you would get 42 virgins in heaven. But as, if you might remember, very early on, it was kind of shown that that connection to the 42 virgins comes from a very, very poorly sourced hadith, and most Muslims kind of disregard it as not being really accurate. And so that's a very weak link. So jihad cannot be used as a war of aggression or for territorial gain, and it can't be used to try to enforce a political order on a people. So it's meant to be a defensive war, which places certain responsibilities on those who are called to engage in it. So as a moral exercise, jihad must be performed strictly under the Islamic rules of engagement. So this means that innocent individuals, women, children, and unarmed civilians cannot be harmed. Property and environment cannot be destroyed, and places of worship of other faiths cannot be demolished. So a lot of the Islamic terrorist groups that have destroyed other religious worship places, or have attacked, like the Manchester bombings, have attacked innocent people, children and women, also unarmed civilians, clearly contradict that conceptual understanding of jihad, and whatever they're doing, it's not jihad. Also on top of this, other examples like kidnapping, hostage taking, indiscriminate shooting of civilians, and placing bombs in areas and buildings where people work are evil deeds that Islam totally condemns. Also on top of this, jihad cannot be declared by anybody on anybody. So for example, jihad cannot be declared by one Muslim country on another, or an oppressive dictator cannot declare jihad on countries lined up against him. Jihad requires a consensus, and this is a really important point. No individual can call jihad. It must be a consensus of the whole Muslim community, and a clear identification of the enemy as the aggressor or the oppressor of helpless victims. Current, like ISIS attacking America, it's not necessarily, it's not accurate, because the wider Muslim community don't agree with it, and also that kind of terrorist attacks, they're acting as the aggressor, and therefore goes against jihad, as it's meant to be a defensive attack, not an aggressive attack. So therefore, it is quite difficult to establish as theoretically or theologically any terrorist attack with Islam. As previously said, any real act of jihad that these Islamic terrorist groups are using, or their justification within Islam, is a very loose interpretation of the religion. And so, theoretically, theologically, it's very hard to connect these acts to Islam. In saying that, though, lots of parallels are drawn between Islam and these terrorist attacks, because these groups name themselves as Muslims. They name it as fighting for Islam. So whether or not theologically this actually connects with the religion, wider community understandings is that it is connected, and these groups themselves call themselves Muslims. So we cannot disregard, even though theologically it doesn't connect with the religion, we can't disregard Islam's connection to these conflicts. But we must always take a note as the understanding of this is a misinterpretation of the religion, or a misunderstanding of the religion, or a misuse of some concepts that exist within the religion. And so whilst there is a connection, it is still a loose connection. So essentially, any kind of terrorist attack is a loose connection to Islam. So if we remember Boko Haram, which were the group that took groups of girls as they were leaving school, and kind of sold them off as sex slaves or as wives to the Mujahideen in Africa. Hamas, which arguably are not terrorists. Some groups see them as terrorists, others see them as freedom fighters. Civil conflict in Yemen. ISIS, obviously, Al-Qaeda. So we've got the Paris attacks in 2015, the Belgium airport attack in 2016, London bombings in 2005, the London attack recently with the guy that drove his car driving up to London's was it Westminster Abbey? No, it was on London Bridge, driving towards London's government house. Also the Bali bombings in 2002. Also the Nice attacks in Paris. In France. Obviously the Manchester bombings last week. And also the boy who shot the police officer in Parramatta. Twin Towers attack, obviously, in 2001. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And again, this is a bit of a debate around whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt are a terrorist group, or they're just kind of like a political group that are fighting for greater Islam within Egypt. So any one of those examples could be used as examples of conflict, again, loosely tied to Islam.